My name is Simone. I am 32 years old. And what I am about to tell you is the story of how I walked into my brother's Christmas dinner as the family joke and walked out as the woman who owned everything they had ever taken from me. They expected me to sit quietly at the end of the table, smile at the right moments, and swallow every insult like I had been doing my entire life. They expected the same Simone they had always known, the one who flinched, apologized, and disappeared into herself whenever the room got too loud. What they did not expect was the woman I had spent 5 years becoming, in complete and total silence. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the beginning. And if you have ever been the one in your family who was counted out before you even had a chance to count yourself in, this one is for you. Growing up in Houston, Texas, our house on Briarwood Lane was the kind of place that looked like a magazine cover from the outside. My parents, Reginald and Dorothy Carter, had built an image so carefully constructed and so obsessively maintained that the walls practically sweated with the effort of keeping up appearances. My father was a deacon at the largest Baptist church on the South Side. My mother chaired 3 charity boards and never left the house without her pearls and a pressed blazer. To the neighborhood, to the congregation, to every single person who passed through their front door, the Carters were the gold standard of Black family success. My older brother, Deshaun, was the crown jewel of that image. He was 4 years older than me, and from the time he could walk, every resource in our household was funneled in his direction like sunlight through a magnifying glass. His football games, his debate team trips, his fraternity dues, his wedding to Brianna, a lavish affair at a country club in the Galleria that my parents spent 3 years paying off. My parents spoke about Deshaun the way some people talk about miracles, with a reverence that left no room for anything else. I was not a miracle. I was a footnote. No matter what I did, it was never quite right. My straight A's were met with, Deshaun had a 4 and was team captain. My acceptance into the business program at the University of Houston was countered with, your brother got into a school with a real name. I learned early that I could not compete, so I stopped trying to compete on their terms and started building something entirely on my own. After graduation, I went to work in corporate finance for 3 years, just long enough to save every dollar I could while living in a studio apartment the size of a generous closet. I ate at home. I drove a 10-year-old Honda. I wore the same rotation of work clothes until the seams started giving out. And during every single lunch break, every single weekend, every single night after work, I was developing my real business. I had discovered a gap in the market for premium, small-batch hot sauces and spice blends inspired by Southern and Creole cooking, the kind of flavors my grandmother had kept in her kitchen in New Orleans, the kind of cooking that corporate food brands had never once taken seriously. I called the brand Bayou and Bloom. I started with 6 products, a rented commercial kitchen space, and a direct-to-consumer website I built myself at 2 in the morning. When I told my mother about it over the phone, she went quiet for exactly 3 seconds before saying, Simone, hot sauce? Really? You have a finance degree. When I told Deshaun, he laughed so hard I had to hold the phone away from my ear. Sis, he said, catching his breath, you are out here playing chef while I am closing real estate deals. Come back to reality. My father simply said nothing, which, in the Carter household, meant the same thing as saying everything. So I said nothing back. I put my head down and I worked. I need you to understand what those 5 years actually looked like, because the numbers at the end of this story do not mean anything unless you understand the ground they were built on. I burned the tips of my fingers testing pepper mash formulations at midnight. I drove to farmers markets in 3 different counties every weekend for 2 years, standing behind a folding table in the Houston heat, handing out samples to strangers who mostly walked past without stopping. I was rejected by every major grocery distributor I approached. Twice, my small batch supplier dropped out and I had to reformulate the entire product line from scratch. I missed holidays. I missed weddings. I missed my cousin's baby shower and my aunt's funeral because I could not afford the flight. And not once, not a single time did anyone in my family call to ask if I needed help. Not once did my mother say, Simone, how is it going? Not once did my father say, I am proud of you for trying something brave. There was only silence from them, or worse, The occasional laughing comment dropped into family group chats like a lit match into dry grass. What they did not know, what I made absolutely certain they did not know, was that in year 3, a regional grocery chain in Louisiana picked up 4 of my products. In year 4, I partnered with a specialty food distributor who placed Bayou and Bloom in stores across 7 southern states. And in year 5, a senior acquisitions director from a major national food corporation reached out to my business email. After 8 months of negotiations, 3 rounds of due diligence, and more legal calls than I could count, they made me an offer. $22 million. All cash. Complete brand acquisition. I had my attorney review every line. I negotiated a 3% royalty on future net sales of the original 6 SKUs, meaning that even after the sale, I would continue earning as long as those products stayed on shelves. My attorney told me it was one of the cleanest exit packages he had seen from a solo founder food brand. I signed the agreement on a Tuesday morning in November. By that Friday, the wire cleared. I was 32 years old, standing in my apartment kitchen, looking at a bank balance that did not feel real, eating leftover red beans and rice from the night before because old habits die hard. I had told no one. 2 weeks later, my mother called. Deshaun was hosting Christmas dinner at his new house, a 5-bedroom colonial in Sugarland that he had been describing to the entire family as his greatest investment for the past year. I was expected to attend. I was expected to bring a side dish. I was expected to smile and ask Brianna about the renovation updates and compliment Deshaun on whatever new thing he had acquired since Thanksgiving. I almost did not go. I had every reason to stay home, pour myself a glass of wine, and spend Christmas quietly in my own company. But something shifted in me that week after the wire cleared. I had spent 5 years being silent out of necessity. This would be the last time I was silent out of habit. I said yes. I made my grandmother's sweet potato pie. And I drove to Sugarland on Christmas evening with a small leather portfolio tucked under my arm. The house was exactly as Deshaun had described it. Large, loud, and performing. Every surface had been decorated within an inch of its life. Garlands over the fireplace. A 12-foot tree in the foyer. Catered food warming in chafing dishes along the dining room wall. Brianna answered the door in a hostess dress, and a smile that was all teeth, no warmth. "Oh, you made it," she said, looking at my pie carrier the way someone looks at a stray dog that followed them home. "We actually have a caterer tonight, so you can just leave that in the kitchen." My mother pulled me into a distracted hug near the entryway. "You look tired," she said, touching my face. "Are you sleeping?" My father shook my hand, an actual handshake, the kind you give a distant acquaintance, and drifted back toward the living room where Deshaun's business partners were gathered with their drinks. Deshaun found me at the kitchen island, maybe 20 minutes into the evening. He was already 2 bourbons in, loose and loud in the way that always preceded his worst behavior. He put a heavy arm around my shoulders and addressed the 3 men standing nearby, men I had never met, like I was a prop in a story he was already telling. "This is my little sister, Simone, the hot sauce lady." He laughed, and they laughed, because the host was laughing. "She has been out here trying to be the next Frank's Red Hot out of a commercial kitchen in Montrose. I keep telling her, 'Simone, come work with me. I will put you in property management, get you something stable.' But she is committed to the dream." He said, "The dream, the way someone says, 'Bless your heart.'" I smiled. I said nothing. I set down my glass of water and excused myself. For the next 2 hours, I watched the performance unfold. Deshaun held court in the living room, narrating his real estate portfolio to anyone who would stand still long enough to listen. Brianna floated from room to room, collecting compliments on the decor. My mother watched Deshaun with the specific pride of a woman who had invested everything in a single outcome and needed that outcome to keep justifying itself. My father sat at the head of the long dining table before dinner was even served, simply because that was the role he had always occupied. I sat near the window and I watched. And I felt something cold and quiet settling behind my sternum. Not anger. Something older and more permanent than anger. A decision. We sat down to dinner somewhere around 7. Deshaun stood at the head of the table to say, grace, which my father allowed the way kings allow their chosen heirs to speak first with a visible, satisfied nod. After the amen, Brianna began directing the flow of conversation with the precision of a traffic controller, steering every topic toward Deshawn's latest projects, his portfolio expansion, his plans for the new year. At some point, my sister-in-law turned to me with the practiced smile of someone performing generosity for an audience. "Simone, how is the little business? Still doing the farmers markets?" The table quieted. Not because they were interested, because it was entertainment. I set down my fork. I took a breath. And then I said, completely evenly, "Actually, I sold the company about 3 weeks ago." Brianna blinked. "Oh, to another small brand?" "No," I said. "To a national corporation." My mother looked up from her plate. "What do you mean sold it?" "I mean a full acquisition. They bought the brand outright." Deshawn leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms with a slow, condescending smile. "Simone, come on. What are we talking, like $50,000? 100? Did some local grocery chain buy your recipe?" He looked around the table, collecting his audience. "No offense, but that is not really a sale. That is more like a licensing situation." I reached down beside my chair and picked up the leather portfolio I had carried in with me. I unzipped it slowly. I pulled out a single document, a clean copy of the executed purchase agreement with the wire transfer confirmation attached, and I set it flat on the table in front of Deshawn. He looked down. I watched his eyes move to the number on the page. I watched them stop. $22 million. The table went silent the way rooms go silent when the power cuts out suddenly, completely, and with a physical weight to it. My mother stood up halfway from her chair without appearing to realize she was doing it. "Simone." Her voice was barely a sound. "What is this?" "That is the acquisition agreement," I said. The wire cleared the week before last. My father picked up the document from the other end of the table, his reading glasses sliding down his nose as he scanned the pages. I watched the color shift in his face from skepticism to disbelief to something that looked almost like calculation. Deshawn recovered first. He always recovered first. That was his gift. He cleared his throat, straightened in his chair, and let the condescending smile return. Slightly restructured now, retrofitted for a new situation. "Okay, so somebody overpaid. Good for you. But, Simone, 22 million, before taxes, before fees, before whatever your lawyer took, you are looking at maybe 14, 15 in your pocket. That is not generational wealth. That is not a portfolio. You need to be putting that into real assets right now before you make a mistake with it. I actually have a development project in Pearland, land acquisition phase. We are looking for private investors, and I could bring you in at a preferred rate. Keep it in the family." He spread his hands generously, the picture of a magnanimous older brother doing his little sister a favor. My mother nodded, turning toward me with an energy I had not seen directed at me since childhood. "He is right, Simone. You need to be smart with this. You cannot just leave that kind of money sitting somewhere, and honestly, your father and I have been stretched very thin this year. The Church Restoration Fund, Deshawn's business, had a slow quarter, and we helped him bridge some expenses we have not been able to put much into retirement. Maybe we can sit down after the holidays and figure out what makes sense for the family." I looked at her. I looked at the face of the woman who had once told me that hot sauce was not a real ambition. "What figure makes sense?" I asked. Specifically, my father set the document down and laced his fingers together. "Simone, your mother and I gave you everything. Every opportunity." He used the voice, the deacon voice, the one that carried the full weight of his moral authority in every syllable. "We are not asking for a handout. We are asking you to recognize what family means. Generational wealth does not belong to one person. It belongs to the bloodline. And right now, this family needs you to step up." I looked around the table, at Deshawn, who was already mentally spending my money on his development project, at Brianna, who was watching me with narrowed, calculating eyes, at my parents, who had spent my entire childhood treating me as the background character in my brother's story, now suddenly discovering that I had written my own. I thought about the 27 times I had called my mother from a car parked outside a farmer's market at 6 in the morning because I needed to hear someone tell me it was going to be okay. The 27 times she had redirected the conversation to Deshawn within 3 minutes. I thought about the year I lived on $700 a month so I could reinvest every other dollar back into the business. I thought about calling my father from the hospital waiting room when I had a stress-related cardiac event at age 29, an actual cardiac event, a physical manifestation of what building something alone in the dark does to a human body, and listening to him tell me that stress was a choice and that I needed to be more disciplined in my lifestyle decisions. I let out a long, slow breath, and then I started talking. I want you to understand something, I said, looking directly at my brother. You have been introducing me as the hot sauce lady for 5 years. At every family dinner, every holiday, every phone call where you asked me, "How is the little business?" with that particular tone you were telling me, and everyone around you, that what I was building did not count, that I did not count. Deshawn opened his mouth. I kept going. You borrowed $40,000 from our parents 3 years ago to cover a shortfall in your second property deal. I know because Dad called me that week to tell me that their savings account was running low and asked if I could send anything. I was 29 years old, living in a 450 square foot apartment, testing pepper formulas on a 2-burner stove. I sent them $2,000, everything I had that was not already committed to inventory, and not one single person at this table said thank you. My mother shifted in her chair. Simone, this is not the place. This is exactly the place, I said. My voice was not raised. It was the opposite of raised. It was the kind of quiet that fills a room the way water fills a container from the bottom up. You want to talk about family stepping up. Let us talk about who was stepping up when it was hard. I looked at my father. When I had the cardiac scare at 29, I called you from the hospital waiting room. You told me stress was a lifestyle choice. I was 29 years old, alone in a waiting room in Houston, and the head of this family told me that my body breaking down under the weight of building something real was a personal discipline problem. My father's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. I turned to Deshawn. 7 years ago, I spent 4 months developing a distribution model for small batch specialty foods in regional grocery markets. I put together a full pitch deck, financial projections, everything. I showed it to you because you were my brother and I trusted you. 2 months later, I found out you had used that same distribution framework. My research, my numbers, my market analysis in a presentation to a food and beverage investment group you were trying to court. You repackaged my work and put your name on it. The deal fell through anyway because you did not understand the model. But you never once told me what you had done. The silence at the table was extraordinary. Deshawn's face had moved through several expressions and arrived at a cold, hard blankness. That is a very serious accusation, he said, his voice careful now. I reached back into the leather portfolio and laid a second document on the table. It was a side-by-side comparison that my attorney had prepared time-stamped notes from my original pitch deck, alongside the presentation materials Deshawn had given to the investment group, which I had obtained through a contact who had been in the room that day. My attorney had flagged 11 direct structural lifts. Brianna stood up abruptly, pulling her chair back from the table with a sharp scrape. "This is our Christmas dinner," she said, her voice high and tight. "This is our home. You do not get to come in here and ruin Christmas with allegations and whatever this is. If you have an issue, you take it to a mediator. You do not ambush people at a dinner table." "I hear you, Brianna," I said without looking at her. "Sit down." She did not sit down, but she also did not leave the room. She stood behind her chair with her hands gripping the back of it, and she stayed. My mother pressed her fingers to her temples. "Simone, what do you want? What is the point of all this? Do you want an apology? Is that what this is? I want you to understand the full picture before you tell me how my money should be allocated for the benefit of this family," I said. "Because you are looking at $22 million and seeing a solution to problems that belong to the people at this table. I need you to understand what that number actually represents before you start telling me about bloodlines and generational wealth." My father cleared his throat. regardless of whatever grievances you are holding on to, Simone. I bought Deshawn's building, I said. The sentence landed in the room like a stone into still water. My father stopped mid-sentence. Brianna's grip on the chair tightened visibly. My mother turned to look at me with an expression that did not have a name. Deshawn's face went very still. What did you say? You have a commercial property on Westheimer, I continued, keeping my voice completely level. The one with the restaurant tenant on the ground floor and 2 small office suites above. The one you have been using as collateral on a private line of credit for the past 14 months. 4 months ago, you defaulted on that line of credit. The private lender initiated a forced sale process. The property was quietly listed through a commercial broker who specializes in distressed asset liquidations. I found out through my own financial advisor, who came across it in a portfolio sweep. I instructed my holding company to make a cash offer through a blind acquisition entity. We closed escrow 6 weeks ago. The color left Deshawn's face in a visible wave, starting at his forehead and moving downward. The restaurant tenant, I continued, is currently paying rent to a property management company that operates under my holding entity, Magnolia Bridge Capital LLC. I have the deed. I own the building. Deshawn pushed back from the table so hard his chair scraped across the hardwood and nearly tipped. He was on his feet, his voice rising in a way I had never heard from him, stripped of its usual polished authority, raw and exposed. You did not tell me you were buying my property. You did not tell me. You let me sit here all night, and you said nothing. You came into my house. I came into your house because you invited me, I said. I spoke calmly, the way a person speaks when they have known for a long time exactly what they are going to say. I came to this dinner and I sat at this table and I listened to you introduce me as the hot sauce lady to your business partners. I listened to you offer to bring me into your investment project at a preferred rate with my own money. I listened to Mom explain how the family finances need my participation now that there is a number on the table. I sat here and I let all of that happen before I said a single word, because I wanted you to show me exactly who you still believed I was. Deshawn turned to my father with a wild, desperate energy. Dad, she bought my building without telling me. She used some shell company that has to be illegal. There are ethics violations here. She has to disclose. My father held up a hand. He looked at me across the table with an expression I had never seen on him before. Not anger, something closer to fear. Simone, he said quietly, how long have you been planning this? Long enough, I said. My mother let out a sound I had never heard from her, not theatrical, not performative, a real, wounded sound. She pressed her hand over her mouth and looked at me with eyes that were suddenly very different from the eyes that had looked past me for 32 years. Did you come here tonight just to do this to us? I came here tonight because this is my family, I said, and I needed you to finally see me. Not the number, me. Brianna dropped into her chair. All of the hostess performance was entirely gone. She looked at her husband, and in that look I saw the first crack of genuine reckoning on her face, not fear of me, but the dawning understanding of what her husband had been hiding from her. Deshawn, she said quietly, how much do you owe on that credit line? He did not answer her. He was staring at the table. How much? She asked again, and this time her voice had a different quality to it entirely. The room held its breath. Deshawn sat back down slowly, heavily, like a man setting down something he had been carrying for too long. He ran both hands over his face. When he spoke, his voice was flat and stripped of everything. 280,000. Brianna looked at him for a long, quiet moment. Then she looked at me. Did you know? She asked. Before you bought it, did you know the whole picture? I knew enough, I said. My financial advisor ran a full encumbrance report before we made the offer. She nodded slowly, the way someone nods when they are processing something they had suspected for a long time. My father leaned forward, his elbows on the table, his interlaced fingers pressed against his mouth. He was doing what he always did when the world stopped cooperating with his narrative, searching for a version of events that still cast him in the right light. Simone, he said, his voice low and careful, I understand you have been carrying a great deal of pain, and I hear you saying that we did not support you the way you needed. But what you have done tonight, this is not healing. This is retaliation. I sat with that word for a moment. Then I said, I spent 5 years building something in complete silence because I knew that if I told you what I was working toward, you would find a way to diminish it. Not because you are bad people, because I was not Deshawn. And everything that was not Deshawn was automatically smaller in this family. I never asked you for money. I never asked you for connections. I never asked any of you for a single thing. What I wanted, what I needed was for someone in this family to look at me and see something worth believing in. That is all I ever wanted. No one said anything. What you are feeling right now, I continued, looking around the table, is what it feels like to finally have to account for a pattern. I am not here to take anything from you. I am not evicting anyone tonight. I am not calling lawyers on Christmas. But I need you to understand, all of you, that the dynamics in this family no longer work the way they have always worked. I am not the footnote anymore. My mother's shoulders had dropped. Her pearls sat slightly crooked at her collarbone and she did not straighten them, which told me more about her current state than anything she could have said aloud. She looked at me with an expression that was exhausted and raw, and genuinely confused the expression of a woman who had organized her entire internal world around one set of priorities and was now being asked to account for what that had cost. I did not know about the hospital, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. The cardiac scare. You never told me it was that serious. You were busy, I said. Not cruelly, just factually. She flinched like I had said something much harder. I reached into the portfolio one last time. I pulled out a single folded letter on plain paper, not a legal document, not a financial statement. I had written it 3 nights before Christmas, sitting at my kitchen table with a glass of wine and 32 years of things I had never been able to say. I unfolded it and set it in the center of the table. That is not a demand, I said. It is not a threat. It is a list of things I needed from this family that I never received and never asked for directly, because I did not believe I was allowed to ask. I am leaving it here. What you do with it is your decision. I stood up from the table. I want to be clear, I said, looking at each of them in turn. I do not hate you. I am not walking away from this family forever. But I am done carrying the version of myself you assigned to me when I was too young to argue with it. The building on Westheimer, my property management team will be in contact with you, Deshawn, about the outstanding rent structure for the office suites. We can work out a fair arrangement. That is not a gift. That is a business decision. The building is an asset, and I intend to manage it as one. Deshawn looked up at me. The bourbon looseness was completely gone. He looked sober in a way that had nothing to do with alcohol. Simone, he said. Just my name. Nothing after it. I picked up my leather portfolio. I zipped it closed. I looked at my mother, who was still sitting with her hand pressed lightly over her heart, and I felt something move in my chest that was not triumph and was not sorrow. It was something older and more tired than either of those things. It was the feeling of a door that had been stuck for a very long time finally moving on its hinges. Tell Grandma Cecile I said Merry Christmas, I said. She called me last week. We talked for an hour. She told me she knew I was going to do something extraordinary since I was 7 years old. I just wanted you to know that somebody in this family was paying attention. I carried my sweet potato pie out of the kitchen on my way to the door. I was not going to leave it there. The foyer was quiet. The 12-foot tree glittered with ornaments Brianna had ordered from a catalog and hung with precision. I looked at it for a moment, all that performance, all that curated beauty maintained for the approval of people who were now sitting in a dining room reassembling their understanding of who I was. I opened the front door myself. The Texas December air was mild and smelled like someone's fireplace 2 houses down. I stood on the brick steps for a moment, holding my pie carrier, and I breathed. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I looked at it. It was a text from my cousin Tamara, who lived in New Orleans, and had known since September because I had needed to tell at least one person. The text said, "How did it go?" I stood on my brother's front steps under the Christmas lights he had strung along the roofline, and I typed back 3 words. Then I walked to my car, not a Maybach, nothing so theatrical as that, just the good used SUV I had bought myself 6 months ago when I finally decided I was allowed to have something nice, and I sat in the driver's seat for a long, quiet moment. I thought about the farmers' market tables in the August heat. I thought about the hospital waiting room at 29. I thought about the night I sat on my kitchen floor surrounded by failed test batches and a bank account with $200 in it, and I told myself, out loud, to a room with no audience, "You are not going to quit." I thought about my grandmother in New Orleans, who had called me last week and said, "Baby, I always knew." Somebody was paying attention. That had been enough to keep going. And now, on the other side of all of it, I had something that no acquisition agreement and no wire transfer could actually quantify. I had the knowledge deep in the bones, irrefutable, proven that I had built something real out of nothing, entirely on my own terms, without a single person in that house believing I could. That knowledge did not have a price tag. Everything else did. I started the car. I pulled away from the curb. Behind me, through the rearview mirror, I could see the lights of my brother's house glowing gold and green against the dark Texas night, beautiful, expensive, and full of people who were, for the first time in as long as any of us could remember, finally being honest with each other. I did not know what would happen next. I did not know if my mother would call me in the morning with a real conversation or a strategy. I did not know if my father would ever say the words out loud. I did not know if Deshawn and Brianna would survive what had been revealed at that table tonight, or if the letter I left would mean anything to anyone by New Year's. But I knew this. I had walked into that house carrying $22 million, a building on Westheimer, and 32 years of things that needed to be said. I had sat at their table and I had let them show me exactly who they still believed I was. And then I had shown them exactly who I had become. The black sheep of the family is usually the only one who can see the whole picture clearly, because she has spent her entire life standing just far enough outside the frame to watch how it was built. And when that black sheep has the receipts, the resources, and absolutely nothing left to prove that is not a sad story anymore, that is the beginning of the only chapter that was ever really hers. Happy holidays, family. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do for yourself is simply refuse to stay small for people who need you small. Simone did not win by becoming cold. She won by finally telling the truth out loud in a room full of people who had never asked for it. Whatever you are quietly building right now, in whatever cramped and unwitnessed corner of your life, somebody is paying attention. Keep going. A small note for you: this story was imagined and written by AI, crafted to entertain you while leaving something worth carrying home. The reminder that your worth was never theirs to measure.